The history they fed you is a lie. 33 people predicted catastrophes, technologies, and political upheavals with such devilish accuracy that one terrifying question arises. What if they didn't predict, but knew? What if behind some prophecies weren't insights, but classified documents, leaks from secret labs, insider information? And now, here's the scariest part. Several of these people tried to prevent catastrophes, and they were silenced. Forever. Forget mysticism and the occult. Right now, we're going to show you 33 cases where knowing the future turned out to be deadly dangerous, and explain why nobody told you about this before. You're used to thinking that prophecies are the domain of charlatans and fortune tellers, vague phrases that can be applied to any event after the fact. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about specific dates, names, technical specifications, geographical coordinates, about predictions that cannot be explained by logic, chance, or coincidence, and most importantly, about people who paid for their knowledge. Some of them died under mysterious circumstances a few months after publication. Others were declared insane and isolated from society. Still others suddenly disappeared from public space and their works, from libraries and archives. A fourth group recanted their own words, as if someone had dictated a retraction to them. Too many coincidences to call it chance. Today, we're cracking open 33 cases, 33 predictions that came true with frightening accuracy, and 33 questions that official science still cannot answer. Get ready. What you're about to learn will make you reconsider everything you thought about the past, present, and future. Let's establish the rules of the game right away. What do we consider a real prophecy versus just a lucky guess or manipulating facts after the fact? The criteria are strict. First, the prediction must be documented before the event. Not in someone's memoirs published decades later, but in books, articles, letters, or interviews that can be verified by date. Second, specificity. No, quote, or one quote. We're looking for details, places, numbers, mechanisms. Third, the event must have actually happened. No reinterpretations or symbolic readings. Fourth, there must be no rational explanation, no inside information, no espionage, no ordinary logical deduction. And now, the most important thing. We're not going to show you every accurate prediction by these 33 people. We'll focus on those that sparked the most questions, on those where the accuracy was so high that it crossed into the realm of the impossible, and on those where the predictors paid for their knowledge. Let's begin. Fact 1. Nikola Tesla, 1896 magazine interview. He describes a device that will allow people to, quote, to. He's 39 years old, radio has just been invented, the telephone is a luxury for the rich, and he's describing a smartphone. Not the idea of wireless communication. That would be logical for an engineer. He's describing a portable video device with instant transmission. Touchscreens, apps, video calls, in 1896, before airplanes, before vacuum tubes, before transistors. Where did he get this? Official version, technical intuition. But let's dig into the details. In that same interview, Tesla describes not just the concept, but the mechanism, electromagnetic waves of different frequencies, signal modulation, miniature receivers. This is exactly how modern cell phones work. But in 1896, nobody knew this was even theoretically possible. Maxwell's equations existed, yes, but nobody had applied them to portable personal communication devices. Nobody except Tesla. And here's the creepy part. After that interview, Tesla gets funding to build a tower, Wardenclyffe Tower, officially for transatlantic radio transmission. But in his notes, later confiscated by the FBI, he describes something else. Global wireless communication for every person on Earth. Not just voice, data, images, video, a wireless internet. In 1901, the project gets shut down. Funding is cut. Tesla dies alone and broke in 1943. His documents are immediately seized by the FBI and classified. Some remain classified to this day. What was in those papers? What did he know that was so dangerous? Fact 2. H.G. Wells, 1914, novel. Quote, 4. He describes atomic bombs, not vaguely, specifically. He writes about, quote, 5. He uses that exact term. Chain reactions, uranium, energy released from splitting atoms. He describes how these bombs will be dropped from airplanes on cities, creating devastation unlike anything the world has seen. He even describes where they'll be tested first, deserts, and he predicts they'll be used in a global war in the 1940s. 30 years later, everything happens exactly as written. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 1945. Testing in the New Mexico desert. Everything Wells described in 1914. Official explanation. Quote, 6. True, Soddy explained radioactive decay to Wells. But Soddy never described chain reactions, never mentioned bombs, never predicted military applications. So where did Wells get these details? Here's where it gets dark. In Wells's novel, he doesn't just describe the bombs, he describes what happens after. He writes about a world government formed specifically to control atomic weapons, to prevent future nuclear war. And this is exactly what happened. The United Nations was created in 1945 for precisely this purpose. How did Wells predict not just the technology, but the geopolitical response? Did he have access to classified military research? Was he being fed information by someone in government or intelligence? After his death in 1946, his personal archive was sealed for 50 years. When it was finally opened, key sections were missing, cut out, gone. What was in those pages? Fact 3. Morgan Robertson, 1898, novel Futility. He describes a giant ocean liner called the Titan, the largest ship ever built, considered unsinkable. In April, on its maiden voyage in the North Atlantic, it strikes an iceberg and sinks. Most passengers die because there aren't enough lifeboats. 14 years later, in 1912, the Titanic sinks in exactly the same way. Same month, same location, same cause. Even the names are nearly identical. Sounds like a coincidence, right? But let's look at the details. Robertson's Titan, 800 feet long, 70,000 tons, carries 3,000 people, has 24 lifeboats. The actual Titanic, 882 feet long, 66,000 tons, carries 3,000 people, has 20 lifeboats. The numbers are shockingly close. Too close. And there's more. In Robertson's novel, the Titan's propellers are described with specific technical specifications. These specs match the Titanic's propellers almost exactly, even though that propeller design didn't exist in 1898. Robertson was a former sailor, so he knew ships. But knowing shipbuilding doesn't explain how he predicted the exact disaster with the exact details. When the Titanic sank, journalists found Robertson and asked him how he knew. He gave vague answers, mumbled about how, quote 9, seemed uncomfortable. 2 years later, he died. Officially, an overdose of medication. Was it suicide, accident, or something else? Fact 4. Edward Bellamy, 1888, novel. Quote 10. He describes the year 2000. In his vision, credit cards, he calls them, quote 11. Shopping malls, radio broadcasting, equal rights for women, retirement pensions, and a socialized economy. He describes how people will use these cards to make purchases without cash, how radio will deliver news and music to every home, how society will guarantee a minimum standard of living. 100 years later, almost everything he described exists. Credit cards, broadcast media, social security, gender equality movements, even the specific mechanisms, magnetic strips on cards, centralized banking systems, match his descriptions. Bellamy wasn't a technologist or economist, he was a journalist. So how did he predict these specific social and technological developments with such accuracy? His novel became a massive bestseller, one of the most influential books in America at the time. But Bellamy died young, at 48, in 1898. The official cause? Tuberculosis. But some researchers note that his health collapsed suddenly, just as his political influence was growing. Coincidence? Fact 5. Jules Verne. Multiple novels, 1860s to 1870s. He predicts submarines that can travel underwater for extended periods, electric chairs, helicopters, missiles, video conferencing, solar sails, and, most famously, moon rockets launched from Florida. 100 years later, Apollo 11 launches from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Verne even calculated the escape velocity needed to reach the moon, and he was remarkably accurate. But here's what's strange. Verne's calculations weren't just lucky guesses. He described orbital mechanics, escape velocity, re-entry procedures. How did a fiction writer in the 1860s know this? The physics existed, yes, Newton's laws, etc. But nobody had applied them to space travel because space travel seemed impossible. And the Florida launch site? Why did Verne specifically choose Florida? He claimed it was because of the latitude. Closer to the equator means more rotational velocity for rocket launches. But that kind of strategic thinking about rocket science in the 1860s, that's not intuition, that's knowledge. Fact 6. Aldous Huxley, 1932, novel. Quote 12. He describes a future where governments use drugs to control populations. Babies are created in laboratories through genetic engineering. People are conditioned from birth to accept their social roles. Entertainment is used as mass distraction, and free will is chemically suppressed. He even describes the drugs. Quote 13, a pharmaceutical that makes people happy, docile, and numb. 90 years later, we have widespread use of antidepressants and psychiatric medications, IVF and genetic screening of embryos, mass media designed to manipulate behavior, and a pharmaceutical industry that medicates every emotion. We don't call it soma, but the function is the same. Huxley wasn't a neuroscientist, so how did he predict the specific mechanisms of neurochemical control? Here's a clue. His brother, Julian Huxley, was a biologist and eugenicist with connections to government research programs. Did Aldous have access to classified research on behavioral modification, genetic engineering, or chemical manipulation? In his later years, Huxley became deeply interested in psychedelics, especially mescaline and LSD. He wrote about their potential to free the mind, but also about their potential to enslave it. Was he speaking from personal knowledge? Did he know about classified programs experimenting with mind-control drugs, programs that would later become MK Ultra? Huxley died in 1963, the same day JFK was assassinated. His death was overshadowed and forgotten, but whispers persist. His cancer was aggressive, sudden, unusual. Was it natural? Fact 7. George Orwell, 1949, novel 1984. He describes a totalitarian surveillance state where telescreens monitor every citizen, the government rewrites history constantly, language is simplified to control thought, newspeak, endless war maintains social control, and people are trained to accept contradictory statements as truth. Doublethink. 70 years later, we have webcams in every device, governments that manipulate information, algorithmic content moderation controlling speech, perpetual military conflicts, and mass acceptance of contradictory narratives in the media. Orwell's vision is our reality. But here's what's terrifying. Orwell didn't just predict surveillance. He described the psychological mechanisms that make it work. He understood how propaganda shapes reality, how fear controls populations, how language limits thought. How did he know? Orwell worked for the BBC during World War II in the propaganda department. He saw firsthand how governments create false narratives. But he may have seen more. Classified research into psychological warfare, mass manipulation, and behavioral control. Research that was developed during the war and expanded afterward, especially during the early Cold War. Orwell wrote 1984 in a fever, dying of tuberculosis, racing against time. He finished it in 1948 and died in 1950. Was he trying to warn us about something specific? Something he'd seen and couldn't forget? Fact 8. Arthur C. Clarke, 1945, technical article. He describes geostationary satellites for global communication. He specifies the exact altitude, 35,786 kilometers, 22,236 miles. He explains the orbital mechanics, how many satellites would be needed for global coverage, 3, and how they would relay signals. 19 years later, the first geostationary satellite, SYNCOM-3, is launched, at exactly that altitude, functioning exactly as Clarke described. Clarke was a radar specialist during World War II, so he had technical knowledge. But orbital mechanics for communication satellites, that was classified rocket science. How did he know the exact altitude? The math is complex. It requires calculating where a satellite's orbital period matches Earth's rotation. Clarke got it exactly right in 1945, before anyone had even launched a satellite into space. And here's what's strange. After publishing that article, Clarke was approached by government officials. What they discussed is unknown. Clarke never spoke about it publicly. But after that meeting, he never published technical predictions again. He switched entirely to science fiction. Safe, deniable fiction. Was he warned, threatened, or bought off? Clarke lived to be 90, dying in 2008. Throughout his life, he remained evasive about how he came up with the satellite idea. Just logic, he'd say. But was it? Fact 9. John Brunner, 1968, novel quote 20. He predicts mass shootings in America, legalization of marijuana, video rental stores, computer viruses, corporate dominance of government, satellite TV, terrorism as a primary threat, and a growing gap between rich and poor. He even describes Detroit becoming economically devastated, which happened. He sets his novel in 2010. When 2010 arrived, almost everything he predicted had come true or was in progress. Brunner wasn't a sociologist or futurologist. He was a science fiction writer. But his accuracy is unsettling. He didn't just predict trends, he predicted specific social phenomena that weren't obvious in 1968. Mass shootings, that wasn't a pattern yet. Corporate control of government, not as blatant. Computer viruses, computers barely existed in homes. Brunner died in 1995, relatively young at 60, from a stroke at a science fiction convention. Before his death, he'd become increasingly reclusive and paranoid. Did he know something? See something? His later works became darker, more dystopian, as if he'd glimpsed a future he didn't want to see. Fact 10. Philip K. Dick, multiple novels and stories, 1950s to 1970s. He predicts reality TV, surveillance drones, predictive policing, memory implantation, virtual reality, artificial intelligence that passes for human, and corporations more powerful than governments. His stories are the basis for Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall, and everything in those films is now either real or in development. But Dick went further. He claimed he had visions, downloads of information from an unknown source. He described it as VALIS, Vast Active Living Intelligence System, an entity that transmitted knowledge directly into his mind. Schizophrenia? Or was he exposed to something? Here's a disturbing fact. Dick was investigated by the FBI in the 1960s and 70s. His files, partially released, show surveillance, infiltration of his social circles, and monitoring of his work. Why? Official reason: drug use and countercultural associations. But some researchers believe he stumbled onto classified programs involving psychological operations, reality manipulation, and perception control. Dick died in 1982 at age 53 from a stroke. Just before his death, he told friends he believed he was being monitored, that, quote, 25, quote, We're getting closer. Paranoia. Or was he right? Fact 11. Isaac Asimov, 1950s. Quote, 26. Series. He predicts psychohistory, mathematical prediction of mass human behavior, decline of large empires, rise of technocratic elites, manipulation of populations through subtle information control, and the role of small groups in steering history. He describes a science that can predict social trends centuries in advance. 70 years later, we have big data analytics, predictive algorithms, mass behavioral manipulation through social media, and evidence that small groups of tech elites shape global narratives. Asimov's psychohistory isn't science fiction anymore. It's what Facebook, Google, and intelligence agencies do every day. Asimov was a biochemistry professor, not a sociologist or data scientist. How did he envision the specific use of mathematics to control social behavior? Did he have knowledge of early computer science, algorithmic theory, or classified social control research? Asimov lived a long life. He died in 1992 at age 72 from AIDS contracted through a blood transfusion during heart surgery. But here's what's odd. He kept his illness secret for years, writing about it only in a private letter that was released posthumously. Why the secrecy? Just stigma? Or was there more? Fact 12. Ray Bradbury, 1953, novel Fahrenheit 451. He predicts wall-sized TV screens, wireless earbuds, interactive television, mass addiction to entertainment, decline of reading, government censorship through distraction rather than force, and people voluntarily choosing ignorance over knowledge. 70 years later, we have 80-inch TVs, AirPods, streaming services, social media addiction, declining literacy rates, and a population that prefers entertainment over information. Bradbury's dystopia is our daily life. But Bradbury wasn't a technologist. He barely used computers, didn't own a cell phone, and was famously technophobic. So how did he predict these specific technologies and their social effects? He claimed it was intuition, watching people's behavior in the early days of television. But his accuracy goes beyond observation. He described the psychological effects of immersive media with clinical precision. Bradbury died in 2012 at age 91, one of the last of the golden age science fiction writers. In his final years, he warned repeatedly about the dangers of technology and mass media. Did he see something in those early days that others missed? Or did someone tell him? Fact 13. Kurt Vonnegut, 1963, novel Cat's Cradle. He predicts climate change caused by human activity, corporate control of scientific research, accidental catastrophic release of dangerous technology, and governments lying about the true dangers of their weapons programs. His fictional Ice-9 is a substance that freezes all water on Earth, a metaphor for technologies that can't be controlled once released. 60 years later, climate change is destroying ecosystems. Corporations fund biased research. Lab leak theories dominate debates about COVID-19, and governments routinely conceal the dangers of their programs. Vonnegut's warning about uncontrollable technology is more relevant than ever. Vonnegut was a public relations writer and a World War II veteran. He survived the Dresden firebombing. Did his military experience expose him to classified information? Did he know about secret weapons programs, geoengineering research, or biological experiments? Vonnegut died in 2007 at age 84 from a fall. But in his later years, he became increasingly outspoken about government lies and corporate control. He warned that America was becoming a fascist state. Was he speaking from personal knowledge? Fact 14. Stanisław Lem, 1961, novel Solaris. He predicts artificial intelligence that humans cannot understand, technology that interacts with human consciousness in unpredictable ways, and the impossibility of true communication with non-human intelligence. But more importantly, he predicts something specific: brain-computer interfaces that trigger memory and emotion. 60 years later, We have neural implants, Neuralink, AI systems that are increasingly opaque and alien in their decision-making, and technology that manipulates brain states. Lem's vision is becoming reality. Lem was a philosopher and futurist, but he wasn't a neuroscientist. How did he predict brain-computer interfaces in 1961, decades before the technology existed? Did he have access to classified Soviet research on neurology, mind control, or cybernetics? Lem lived in communist Poland, under constant surveillance. His works were sometimes banned, sometimes tolerated. Some biographers believe he had indirect contacts with intelligence agencies from both East and West. Did those contacts give him information? Or was he being fed disinformation? Lem died in 2006 at age 84, having witnessed many of his predictions come true. In his final interviews, he expressed deep pessimism about technology and human nature. Did he see where this was all heading? Fact 15. Arthur Conan Doyle. Early 1900s, beyond Sherlock Holmes. He predicted forensic science as we know it, fingerprints, blood analysis, crime scene investigation, submarine warfare, and the use of aircraft in military reconnaissance. In his Sherlock Holmes stories, he described forensic techniques that didn't exist yet, but would later become standard police procedure. Conan Doyle was a medical doctor, which gave him some scientific knowledge. But forensic science didn't exist as a discipline in the 1890s. He was describing methods, fingerprint analysis, chemical testing of blood, analysis of soil and tobacco, that wouldn't be adopted by police for decades. How did he know these methods would work? Here's where it gets weird. Conan Doyle was also deeply involved in spiritualism and claimed to communicate with the dead. Was this genuine belief? Or was it cover for something else? Some researchers believe he was connected to British intelligence and that his spiritualism was either a front for espionage or a way to receive information from classified sources. Conan Doyle died in 1930 at age 71, a firm believer in the supernatural. But was his belief real, or was he protecting secrets? Fact 16. E.M. Forster. 1909, short story, The Machine Stops. He describes a future where humanity lives underground, completely dependent on a global machine for all needs. People communicate only through screens. Physical contact is considered obscene, and when the machine fails, civilization collapses. He describes instant messaging, video calls, and a society where people never leave their rooms. Over a century later, we have the internet, smartphones, social media, and a generation that prefers digital interaction to physical presence. During COVID-19, the world went into lockdown and everything moved online, just as Forster described. When internet services go down, modern society briefly panics. Forster's quote 33 is the digital infrastructure we depend on. Forster was a novelist, not a technologist. How did he predict global digital dependence in 1909, before electricity was even widespread? He claimed the story was a reaction against H.G. Wells's optimism about technology. But his specific predictions, video communication, instant messaging, social isolation, go beyond mere pessimism. They're precise. Forster lived to be 91, dying in 1970, just as the first computer networks were being developed. Did he realize his prediction was coming true? Fact 17. Aldous Huxley, again. 1958, essay quote 34. 26 years after his novel, Huxley wrote a non-fiction analysis warning that his dystopian vision was arriving faster than he'd predicted. He specifically warned about mass media propaganda, pharmaceutical control of behavior, overpopulation leading to authoritarian control, and subliminal manipulation through advertising and entertainment. He wrote this in 1958, before the internet, before mass psychiatric medication, before modern advertising psychology was fully developed. How did he know it would accelerate? In the essay, he describes specific techniques: repetition, emotional manipulation, creating artificial needs. These are exactly the techniques used today by social media algorithms. pharmaceutical marketing, and political propaganda. 5 years after writing this essay, Huxley died. Some believe he knew too much and was silenced. Others think he simply saw the patterns and extrapolated. But his accuracy is chilling. Fact 18. George Orwell, again. Before 1984, Orwell wrote essays predicting the decline of language, political manipulation of words, the use of vague language to obscure truth, and the specific ways governments would use propaganda in the television age. His 1946 essay, Politics and the English Language, describes exactly how modern political rhetoric works. Euphemisms, passive voice, meaningless words that sound important. 75 years later, this is the standard language of corporate and political communication. Collateral damage instead of dead civilians. Let go instead of fired. Enhanced interrogation instead of torture. Orwell predicted this specific linguistic manipulation. How did he know? Because he'd worked in propaganda and seen how language shapes thought. But his predictions went beyond what existed in 1946. He described a future where language itself would be engineered to limit what people could think. And that's exactly what happened with politically correct language, algorithmic content moderation, and newspeak in corporate culture. Fact 19. William Gibson, 1984, novel Neuromancer. He invents the term cyberspace and describes the internet before it was widely known, hackers, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, corporate control of digital space, and brain-computer interfaces. His matrix is essentially the World Wide Web, described 5 years before it was created. Gibson wasn't a programmer or engineer. He wrote the book on a manual typewriter and knew almost nothing about computers. So how did he describe cyberspace with such accuracy? He claimed he saw kids playing arcade games and extrapolated, but his vision goes far beyond arcade games. He described data visualization, virtual environments, hacking culture, and the social structure of online communities. All of this in 1984, before most people had even heard of the internet. Gibson is still alive, and he's been remarkably quiet about how he came up with his ideas. In interviews, he deflects, saying it was just imagination. But was it? Fact 20. Pat Frank, 1959, novel Alas, Babylon. He describes a nuclear war between the US and Soviet Union, triggered by a misunderstanding in the Middle East, leading to the destruction of major cities and long-term radioactive contamination. He describes the specific effects of fallout, the breakdown of social order, and how survivors would adapt. What's eerie? Frank describes electromagnetic pulse, EMP effects, electronics being fried by nuclear detonations. This effect wasn't widely known in 1959. It was classified military knowledge. How did Frank know? He'd been a journalist covering military affairs, but the specific details in his book suggest access to classified information about nuclear weapons effects. Frank died in 1964, just 5 years after publication, from a heart attack. He was only 58. No investigation, no questions. Fact 21. Robert Heinlein. Multiple novels, 1940s to 1960s. He predicts waterbeds, microwave ovens, mobile phones, computer viruses, moving walkways, tasers, space stations, and genetic engineering. But his most disturbing prediction, the rise of religious authoritarianism in America. In quote 48, 1961, he describes how charismatic leaders would use religion and media to build cult-like followings. 60 years later, we've seen the rise of evangelical political movements, cult-like devotion to political leaders, and the use of media to create religious political hybrids. Heinlein warned about this specific phenomenon. Heinlein had connections to military and aerospace industries. He worked as an engineer during World War II. Did those connections give him access to classified technology development? His technical predictions are too specific to be just imagination. Heinlein died in 1988 at age 80, having seen many of his predictions come true. In his later years, he became increasingly libertarian and warned about government overreach. Did he know something? Fact 22. Anthony Burgess, 1962, novel A Clockwork Orange. He predicts youth gang violence as a social epidemic, government use of behavioral conditioning to control criminals, debate over free will versus social control, and the weaponization of psychology by the state. He describes a specific technique, using aversion therapy to reprogram human behavior. 60 years later, we have debates about criminal justice reform, use of medications to control behavior, and psychological techniques used in prisons and rehabilitation programs. Burgess's quote 50 is essentially what modern behavioral modification programs attempt. But here's what's disturbing. Burgess describes this technique with clinical accuracy, the use of drugs, visual stimuli, and induced nausea to create aversion. This wasn't common knowledge in 1962. Was Burgess aware of classified government experiments in behavioral modification? Programs like MKUltra were happening at exactly that time. Burgess died in 1993 at age 76 from lung cancer. He spent his later years warning about government control and loss of individual freedom. Fact 23. Yevgeny Zamyatin, 1924, novel We. Written in Soviet Russia, he predicts totalitarian surveillance state, glass buildings so everyone can be watched, genetic engineering, lobotomies for dissenters, and complete elimination of privacy and individuality. His dystopia influenced both Orwell and Huxley, but it's more extreme. He describes a state that doesn't just control behavior, but surgically alters the brain to eliminate free will. 100 years later, China's social credit system, mass surveillance, and rumors of forced psychiatric treatment for dissenters echo Zamyatin's vision. But how did he predict this in 1924, just 7 years after the Russian Revolution? The Soviet surveillance state wasn't fully developed yet. So how did he know where it was heading? Here's the dark truth. Zamyatin was an engineer who worked on Soviet industrial projects. He had access to Bolshevik planning documents and saw the blueprints for total social control. His novel wasn't prediction, it was exposure. He was revealing what the Soviet government was planning. The book was banned in the Soviet Union. Zamyatin was persecuted and eventually allowed to emigrate in 1931, but only after intense international pressure. He died in Paris in 1937, at age 53, impoverished and broken. Some believe the Soviet secret police poisoned him, even in exile. Fact 24. Karel Čapek, 1920, play. Quote 52. Rossum's Universal Robots. He invents the word robot and predicts artificial workers replacing humans, robots becoming self-aware and rebelling, and humanity becoming dependent on automated labor. The play describes a scenario where robots become more efficient than humans, leading to mass unemployment and eventual human extinction. 100 years later, we're facing exactly this scenario: automation replacing jobs, AI becoming increasingly autonomous, and debates about whether artificial intelligence will remain under human control. Čapek's warning is now mainstream discussion, but Čapek went further. He predicted that the robots would be biological, not mechanical, artificial organisms created in factories. This is closer to genetic engineering and synthetic biology than traditional robotics. How did he predict this in 1920, decades before DNA was understood? Čapek died in 1938, at age 48, just before the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia. Official cause: pneumonia, but he'd been on the Nazi blacklist for his anti-fascist writings. Many believe he was murdered or died from stress and fear. Fact 25. Aldous Huxley, yet again. 1956, essay, quote, 54. He describes how psychedelic drugs open consciousness and could be used either for enlightenment or control. He specifically warns that governments and corporations could use these drugs to manipulate populations, creating docile or aggressive states as needed. A decade later, the CIA's MK Ultra program is exposed. They'd been experimenting with LSD and other drugs for mind control since the 1950s. Huxley's warning was prescient. But how did he know? He was experimenting with mescaline under the supervision of psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. But was Osmond just a psychiatrist? Or was he connected to classified research programs? Some researchers believe Huxley was deliberately exposed to psychedelics as part of a broader experiment, that he was a test subject who was aware he was being tested. His writings about drugs are too informed, too specific. He describes mechanisms and effects that weren't publicly known. Fact 26. John Wyndham, 1951, novel quote 55. He predicts genetic engineering gone wrong, biological weapons that escape control, and societal collapse from a combination of blindness, literal and metaphorical, and environmental disaster. His quote 56 are genetically modified plants that become dangerous. 70 years later, we have GMO crops, debates about CRISPR and genetic engineering risks, concerns about lab-created pandemics, and environmental crises. Wyndham's warning about playing with nature is more relevant than ever. Wyndham worked in British intelligence during World War II. Did he have access to classified research on biological warfare? The British were experimenting with anthrax and other bioweapons during the war. Did Wyndham see those programs and extrapolate? Wyndham died in 1969 at age 65 from a stroke. He'd been largely forgotten by then, but his warnings about genetic engineering would later prove prophetic. Fact 27. Olaf Stapledon, 1930, novel quote 57. He predicts genetic engineering to create new human species, terraforming of other planets, decline of current civilization, and rise of new ones, and humanity evolving over millions of years. He describes 18 different future human species, each adapted to different environments. 90 years later, we're beginning genetic modification of humans, CRISPR, discussing Mars colonization, and acknowledging that current civilization may collapse. Stapledon's vision of human-directed evolution is becoming possible. But Stapledon wasn't a scientist. He was a philosopher. How did he predict genetic engineering in 1930, before DNA was discovered? He describes something remarkably close to modern evolutionary biology and genetic manipulation. His accuracy is unsettling. Stapledon died in 1950 at age 63, having lived through both world wars. Did he see humanity's capacity for self-destruction and extrapolate? Fact 28. Walter M. Miller Jr., 1959, novel. Quote 58. He predicts nuclear war destroying civilization, technological knowledge being lost and slowly rediscovered, and religious institutions preserving fragments of science through dark ages. He describes cycles of civilization, rise, fall, rise again, with each cycle making the same mistakes. 60 years later, we face the threat of nuclear war, climate collapse, and societal breakdown. Miller's warning about cyclical destruction is becoming real. But more disturbing, he predicted that humanity would rebuild, reach the same technological level, and destroy itself again with nuclear weapons. An eternal cycle of doom. Miller was a World War II bomber pilot who participated in the destruction of a Monte Cassino monastery, an event that haunted him and inspired the novel. Did his military experience expose him to classified war plans or nuclear strategy? His descriptions of nuclear warfare effects are extremely detailed. Miller committed suicide in 1996 at age 72. He'd struggled with depression for decades, haunted by his wartime experiences. Did he see something during the war that broke him? Fact 29. Frederick Pohl, 1954, short story quote 59 quote. He predicts consumerism as societal control, where poor people are forced to consume while rich people live simply, mass production creating waste rather than wealth, and advertising as a form of oppression. He describes a world where happiness is measured by consumption and people are legally required to consume. 70 years later, we live in exactly this world. Planned obsolescence, fast fashion, waste culture, and advertising that creates artificial needs. Pohl's satire became reality, but Pohl went further. He predicted that this system would eventually collapse under its own weight. Too much production, too much waste, environmental destruction. He saw that consumerism was unsustainable. This wasn't obvious in 1954, during the golden age of American prosperity. Pohl lived to be 93, dying in 2013, having watched the world become his dystopia. In his later years, he warned about climate change and resource depletion. Did he know this was inevitable? Fact 30. Ursula K. Le Guin, 1974, novel quote 60. She predicts anarchist societies as viable alternatives to capitalism and communism, ecological collapse forcing new social structures, physics breakthroughs enabling instantaneous communication across vast distances, and gender equality as fundamental to advanced societies. Her physics, the quote 61, is remarkably similar to quantum entanglement theories proposed decades later. 50 years later, we're seeing experiments in alternative governance, blockchain, DAOS, climate crisis forcing social restructuring, quantum communication research, and feminist movements reshaping society. Le Guin's vision is becoming real. But Le Guin wasn't a physicist. How did she describe quantum entanglement principles in 1974 before they were widely known? Her Ansible works exactly like theoretical quantum communication. Was she reading classified physics research? Le Guin died in 2018 at age 88, one of the most respected science fiction writers. She spent her final years advocating for environmental protection and social justice. Did she see the future she'd written about arriving? Fact 31. Octavia Butler, 1993, novel. Quote 63. She predicts climate refugees, privatized cities, societal collapse in America, corporations replacing governments, water scarcity wars, and the rise of a demagogic presidential candidate whose slogan is, quote 64. She wrote this in 1993. Trump's slogan appeared in 2016. She predicted it by 23 years, but she went further. Butler predicted that climate change would destroy California, that gangs would control territories, that a fascist religious movement would take over America, and that people would form small survival communities. Everything she predicted is either happening or imminent. Butler wasn't a political analyst. She was a black woman writing science fiction. How did she predict the exact political slogan? How did she see climate collapse and fascist politics merging? Her accuracy is terrifying. Butler died in 2006 at age 58 from a fall. She hit her head and died alone. No witnesses, no investigation. She'd been warning about the future in interviews, becoming increasingly urgent. Did she know something? Did she see it coming? Fact 32. Margaret Atwood, 1985, novel The Handmaid's Tale. She predicts theocratic takeover of America, women's rights being stripped away, environmental collapse leading to infertility, and a surveillance state enforcing religious law. She describes specific mechanisms: forced pregnancy, ritualized rape, color-coded social classes, and public executions. 40 years later, Roe v. Wade was overturned, Christian nationalism is rising, environmental toxins are causing fertility decline, and surveillance technology is everywhere. Atwood's dystopia is closer than ever. But here's the key. Atwood claimed she included nothing in the novel that hadn't already happened somewhere in history. She wasn't predicting, she was compiling. She was showing that all the pieces already existed. But her genius was seeing how they would combine in America. How did she know it would go this specific direction? Atwood is still alive, now 85, and has watched her dystopia become increasingly real. She's been warning, speaking out, saying, "I told you so." But is anyone listening? Fact 33. Artificial intelligence and predicting human behavior. A system that knows what you'll do tomorrow better than you do. This isn't science fiction. This is your life right now. The 2010s. Cambridge University publishes research. An algorithm based on analyzing Facebook likes predicts a person's personality more accurately than their friends and family. 68 likes. The algorithm knows you better than a coworker. 150 likes. Better than a parent. 300 likes. Better than a spouse. At a certain point, the algorithm knows you better than you know yourself. This isn't prediction. This is determinism. Your behavior is so patterned, so predictable, that a simple algorithm can forecast your decisions. What you'll buy, who you'll vote for, what you'll think, where you'll go. Now scale this up. Google knows where you've been and where you're going. Amazon knows what you want before you want it. Facebook knows your emotional state and can manipulate it. TikTok knows what will hold your attention down to the second. These aren't predictions, they're controls. The final prophecy isn't written by a person. It's written by machine learning, by algorithms trained on billions of data points. And the prophecy is this: you have no free will. Your choices are predetermined by patterns you don't even see. You think you're deciding, but you're following a script written by your data profile. The 33 people we discussed predicted the future because they saw patterns, had access to information, or stumbled onto dangerous knowledge. But now the future isn't predicted by people. It's calculated by machines. And the calculation says, you're predictable, you're controllable, you're no longer the author of your own story. So here's the final question. Are you reading this because you chose to, or because an algorithm knew you would? So here's the final question. Are you reading this because you chose to, or because an algorithm knew you would? If this video made you question everything you thought you knew about the past, present, and future, hit that subscribe button. Because what you just learned, that's only the beginning. There are more secrets buried in history, more predictions that came true for the wrong reasons, and more questions that no one wants to answer. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because we're going deeper. We're exposing the predictions they don't want you to know about, the prophecies that were too accurate, the people who paid the ultimate price for knowing too much. Don't just watch, join us. Be part of the community that refuses to accept the official story. Hit subscribe, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this with someone who needs to wake up. The algorithm brought you here. Now choose to stay.